What is your most memorable experience studying engineering? Story 1. It was in my final year that I attended my first ever party hosted by the engineering faculty. Until then, I had only seen my course mates in class or at engineering-related events. There were other casual events over the years, but I had never attended any of them. At that party, I was completely shocked. I saw my course mates in a way I had never seen before. They were dancing, playing, and just having fun. It was a side of them I hadn't experienced. I realized that up until then, I had only known them in the context of academics and never in a more relaxed, social setting. This experience opened my eyes, and before I graduated, I made it a point to attend as many events as possible. I wanted to create more fun memories, not just the academic ones, although I have to admit, some of those book memories were also pretty fun. Story 2. One thing that stands out from my experience as an engineering student is the constant fear of courses that required prior knowledge from another course. It was always a challenge. I remember studying intensely for exams, only to forget almost everything by the second week after the exams were over. When a course required prior knowledge, it meant going back and doing a lot of extra reading and revision. Thankfully, the revisions were easier than starting from scratch, but it was still a lot of work. Now, just 2 years later, I can barely remember anything about some of those courses. I am sure it is like that for other disciplines. It's funny how much effort we put into learning something that seems to fade so quickly. Story 3. One Thursday, I had a casting experiment to attend, but there was also a contest that I'd been looking forward to for a long time happening on the same day. I decided to skip the experiment and go to the contest instead. While I was there, someone called to tell me that my head of department was in the lab looking for me to ensure I was present. I was stunned. Though I was the class rep, I wasn't expecting that. I quickly took a cab and then sprinted to the lab. Unfortunately, by the time I got there, the head of department had already left. Story 4. I had this strict lecturer who taught a lab course. We were required to submit our filled lab manuals on time, or he wouldn't accept them. He instructed us to come to the lab before 9 a.m. to submit our manuals. I arrived early to ensure I didn't miss the submission time, as I had once before. There was a list of everyone taking the lab course, each with a number attached. Instead of calling out names, the lecturer decided to call numbers, and we had to signify when our number was called. My number was 8, but for some reason, when he called 8, I didn't respond. He went through the numbers 3 times. When he told us to leave, I realized he hadn't collected my manual because I hadn't responded when he called my number. I approached him, explaining that he hadn't taken my manual since he didn't call my number. When he asked what my number was and I replied 8, he said, "I called your number several times, and you didn't respond." Despite my begging, he refused to accept my manual and told me to leave. I even brought the student union vice president to plead on my behalf, but the lecturer remained adamant. That lab course was worth 1 unit, with 4 labs in total, and out of those 4, I was only able to submit 1 lab report. Eventually, I had to drop the course. Story 5. There was this 3-unit course that I had a test for once. I wasn't prepared at all and ended up failing the test with only 6 out of 30 marks. Before the exam, I did my best to study, but I was only able to fully understand 1 topic in the course. The exam had 7 calculation questions, and we had to answer 5. I did the best I could on the 1 question from the topic I knew, then took 3 other questions and solved them as if they were from that topic, manipulating my answers. For the last question, I just wrote down the parameters and drew a diagram. When the results came out, I was shocked and happy to see that I had earned a D. It was the first time I got a D in a 3-unit course, and oddly enough, I was smiling. I had been expecting the worst. Story 6. We all filed into the exam hall and got seated, waiting for the question paper after being handed our answer booklets. The dean of engineering entered and announced that he had heard rumors of cheating, so he was moving around the halls to keep an eye on things. He instructed us all to place our exam passes on the table, which we did. He then proceeded to check each student's pass until he reached one particular guy. For some reason, the dean decided to open this guy's answer booklet. When he did, he laughed, and everyone turned to watch. The dean brought the guy to the front row and asked for his name and matric number, which he provided. The guy was then made to fill out a malpractice form. From what I later heard, the guy had brought in a cutout answer booklet with pre-written answers. The cheating wasn't even the worst part. After the exam, the invigilator instructed us to pass our answer booklets to the person sitting at the edge of the table. I was sitting at the edge, so the others passed theirs to me. I noticed that the name the guy had called earlier was the same as the one on the question paper I had just seen. I informed the invigilators, who then called the person with that name out. The dean was called back, and when they checked the malpractice form that had been filled out, they discovered that the guy had written another person's name and matric number. It was a joint course with multiple engineering departments, so I didn't know either of the guys, but I believe they knew each other. I'm not sure what punishment was handed out, but I think they eventually caught the guy. Story 7. My group was supposed to submit a lab report by Wednesday before 12 p.m. to an engineer. When I got to his office, he wasn't around, and the person there told me to come back the next day, as the engineer wouldn't be returning that day. So, I left. At that time in school, I didn't check my messages frequently. When I finally did, late in the evening, I saw a message from earlier that afternoon stating that the engineer had returned to school. I inquired in the group chat about my situation as I hadn't submitted the report. I was relieved when I was told that the engineer would allow those who had left the school by the time he returned to submit the next day. The next day, I went to the engineer's office in the afternoon, only to find out that he had left in the morning and others had come to submit their reports early. No one had mentioned a specific time. I was also told that he wouldn't be returning to school that Thursday. I got his number from the person in his office and called him outside. He didn't pick up but called me back. As I was explaining my situation, he abruptly hung up. I tried calling him back, but he didn't answer. The person in his office then came out and told me to stop calling, as the engineer was complaining that I was disturbing him. On Friday, I arrived at his office very early and waited for hours. When he finally arrived in the afternoon, I knocked and entered his office. He was on the phone, so I stood there waiting. He put down the phone and said, "Is this your office?" You walked in and stood there. "Can't you see I'm on the phone? Get out." I went outside and waited for his call to end. When it did, I knocked again, and he told me to come in. When I got in, I explained that I hadn't been able to submit my report. He angrily asked if that was his problem. The person in his office helped me explain how I had tried to submit on Wednesday and Thursday. He finally allowed me to drop off the report. When I signed the sheet to confirm that I had submitted it, I noticed that he had added an asterisk next to my name. I sighed, signed, thanked him, and left. Story 8. In my second year, I took a fluid dynamics course. At first, I didn't really understand the material, but I studied hard to grasp it. A test was scheduled, and I spent the day before trying to cover as much as possible. On the day of the test, I entered the class, and the lecturer handed out a one-question test. I was so confused when I saw the question, I didn't know what to do. I read the question over and over again, but I couldn't figure out how to approach it. I ended up drawing a free body diagram, writing down the parameters, and listing all the fluid dynamics formulas I knew, filling up about 2 pages. After the test, I left the room quickly. Later, when I got back to my room and calmed down, I took a nap. Afterward, I reviewed the question and realized that I understood how to solve it. I solved some related problems from my textbook, and later that week I solved the test question too. I think the problem was that I hadn't practiced solving enough problems from the course, so I froze during the test. After that experience, I made sure to practice solving problems before any test or exam. When the lecturer returned our scripts, I saw that I had scored 0 on the test. I did my best on the exam and ended up with a C in the course. Story 9. In my university, the people who handle the labs are different from the actual lecturers who teach the courses. For one of my courses, there were 4 labs, each worth 10% of the total course grade. Lab sessions were scheduled for 8 a.m. on Thursdays for the 4 weeks the lab ran. On the first day, we were informed about the rules. If you didn't bring your lab manual, weren't wearing safety boots and a lab coat, or were late, you wouldn't be allowed to participate in the lab that day. That meant losing 10 marks. I usually packed my bag the day before classes to make sure I was prepared. But on the 3rd day of the lab, I somehow forgot to bring my lab manual. I arrived at the lab early and waited until 8:10 a.m. when the lab instructor came in. He took attendance, and we all prepared to start the lab by taking out our manuals. That's when I realized I didn't have mine. I usually stayed close to the front of the lab to see what was going on, but when I noticed my mistake, I started slowly moving toward the back. The instructor saw me and called me to the front. He looked at me and asked for my manual. I tried to explain, but he just crossed out my name on the attendance sheet for that day's lab. Even though I stayed for the lab, I had lost the marks. Please leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.